11-year-old girl Linda O'Keefe left school one summer day and vanished without a trace. This mysterious case became one of the most confounding and chilling in California history, filled with unexpected twists and strange circumstances. It took a whole 45 years before the truth finally came to light, but even then, the story was far from over. In this video, we will uncover the mystery of what happened to Linda, and why this investigation captured the attention of millions around the world. Linda O'Keefe was born on May 24, 1962, in the small California town of Newport Beach. She was raised in a loving and close-knit family. Linda's father worked as a machinist, and her mother was a seamstress. The girl had two sisters, one older and one younger. Linda adored drawing, playing the piano, and had a sincere passion for nature and animals. On nice summer days, she never missed an opportunity to take a stroll to the beach, which was only 800 meters from her house. In addition, the girl was a member of the Girl Scouts organization and attended summer school. In July 1973, when Linda turned 11, she went there almost every day. Usually, Linda got to school by bike, but on the morning of July 6, her piano teacher, who lived near the O'Keefe family, agreed to give her a ride. After classes ended, around 12:30 p.m., Linda used the school phone to call her mom. She asked to be picked up since she didn't have her bike that day. However, her mother was working at home and didn't want to be distracted, so she told her daughter to walk back. Despite the distance from school to home being a little over 2 kilometers, Linda didn't feel like walking at all. After talking to her mother, the girl even started crying, and the school secretary considered driving her. But the woman needed to go in the opposite direction, so she dismissed the idea. Linda left the school, sat a bit near the building, and then headed towards home. Her route should have taken no more than 30 minutes, but the girl was clearly delayed. At first, her mother wasn't too worried. She assumed that Linda might have met up with friends and gone to hang out with them. However, with each passing hour, the concern grew. By 6 in the evening, the mother decided to call all the acquaintances whose children lived nearby and could be spending time with her daughter. But none of them had seen Linda that day. When the father returned from work, the family organized a search. They drove around the entire neighborhood, including the route Linda would have taken to return from school. At that point, the parents still assumed that the girl might have been offended by her mom's refusal to pick her up and was purposely not coming home. But when the search yielded no results and it got dark outside, they turned to the police. Officers took a missing child report and began the search. At the same time, Linda's father, along with her older sister, set out again to comb the area in 2 cars. The mother stayed at home, calling dozens of people who could have even theoretically seen Linda. The search lasted all night. Police officers examined streets and parks, brought in service dogs and a helicopter, but it was all in vain. In the morning, even more officers joined the search operation. Local newspapers were already trumpeting the massive efforts aimed at finding the missing 11-year-old girl. Around 10:30 a.m., a cyclist with his companions and son was riding through a park located 9 kilometers from Linda's house. They arrived here to observe the local fauna for their botanical club. The father and child dismounted and headed towards a ditch, hoping to see frogs. But something completely different awaited them. Noticing something light among the grass, the man approached closer and saw a human body, half submerged in water. In the morning newspaper, he had read about the girl's disappearance, which police had been searching for all night, so he immediately assumed that the discovered body belonged to her. The next moment, the man and his companions rushed out of the park, jumped into their cars, and raced to find the nearest payphone to report the terrible discovery. On the way, they came across a police officer who was participating in the search for Linda. After hearing their story, he immediately passed on the information and headed to the specified location. Investigators instantly recognized the deceased as Linda O'Keefe. She was wearing the same clothes she had gone to school in, and her backpack lay nearby. The clothes, including a white dress, were smeared with mud. At the same time, there were no shoes on the body, they were never found in the vicinity. Detectives began examining the crime scene. They discovered tire tread marks on the ground near the body, but there were no other clues there. Forensic experts established that the cause of death was strangulation. They also determined that death occurred between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. Investigators understood that Linda was most likely abducted shortly after she left school, meaning the criminal had held her somewhere for about 12 hours. The victim had also been sexually assaulted. Traces of semen were found on her body. They were sent to the lab for storage since DNA analysis was not yet conducted in those days. Without any substantial leads, detectives set about searching for witnesses. They questioned all of Linda's friends, school employees, and residents of the streets the girl would have taken home. Soon this bore fruit. Linda's friend, who saw her on the way from school, noticed something strange. Linda was walking along the road, and at one point, a turquoise van stopped next to her. It slowed down and drove alongside the girl. But what happened next, the friend no longer saw, as Linda and the van disappeared from view. Almost immediately, the police managed to find two more witnesses. A 15-year-old girl and her mother were driving in a car about 100 meters from Linda's school. At one point, they noticed the girl talking to the driver of a turquoise van that had stopped beside her. This happened around 1:15 p.m. The witnesses lived near the O'Keefe family and knew them well. Therefore, they were very surprised to see Linda talking to some adult man right on the street, and they decided to take a closer look at what was happening. The passenger door of the van was open, and Linda was standing right in front of it. It seemed she was talking about something with the driver, and then suddenly got into the car. Immediately after that, the van drove off. The witnesses didn't attach much importance to it. They assumed that Linda was picked up by someone from her relatives or acquaintances, as they were convinced the girl would never get into a car with a stranger. After questioning the 15-year-old girl and her mother, the investigators were able to compile an approximate portrait of the van driver. According to them, it was a Caucasian man aged 24 to 32. He had light curly hair and an elongated face. Unfortunately, the witnesses did not remember the vehicle's license plate or even its make. Despite this, their testimony became the only significant lead in the investigation. So the detectives compiled a description of the suspect and his vehicle based on this description. This information was sent throughout California, but it yielded no results. Investigators returned to talk to these women several more times, hoping they would be able to recall some additional details. At one point, they were even offered to undergo hypnosis, to which they agreed. This only had a partial effect. The witnesses were able to remember a few more details about the suspect's car. But they were all too minor to significantly aid in the search for the killer. Soon the police managed to find another witness. A woman who lived near where Linda's body was found heard a female scream around 10:30 p.m. According to her, someone was shouting something like, "Stop, you're hurting me." But this voice abruptly cut off. Considering that the girl died at about the same time, it's quite likely that the witness heard her. After that, the detectives received another interesting lead. In the morning, when Linda's body was found, an artist was painting a picture in the same park. When he saw a dozen police cars, he began observing what was happening, realizing that something serious had occurred. At one point, he noticed something strange. Besides the police, there was a young man in the park who was watching everything that was going on from the sidelines. He was standing quite close to the artist, so the latter decided to inquire about what was going on. The young man looked extremely agitated and reported that the police had discovered the body of a little girl. But the artist and this stranger were at a considerable distance from where the body was found, so they couldn't make out any details. The detectives had a logical question: how did this man know that it was specifically the body of a girl that was found? The artist described the stranger as a slender white man aged 18 to 24, about 180 centimeters tall, with light hair and sideburns. These features were quite similar to the description of the van driver provided by the two witnesses earlier. Ultimately, the investigators concluded that this man was the killer. He had returned in the morning to watch the police actions. But despite a fairly detailed description of the criminal's appearance, finding him in a big city was extremely problematic. However, 2 days later, an unexpected turn occurred. An 18-year-old Peter Wooten came to the police station and confessed to committing the murder. The young man lived near the O'Keefe family and was in the same class as the victim's older sister, Cindy. This news instantly spread throughout the city, shocking its residents. The police, who were not expecting this development, interrogated the boy for 7 hours straight. They also conducted a search at his parents' house, where he lived. After that, Peter was officially charged with murder. But 3 days later, everyone was in for another unexpected twist. The investigators announced that all charges against Peter had been dropped and he had been released. As it turned out, there were too many inaccuracies in his confession. The only matches in his story related to information that had made it into the newspapers. In everything else, he knowingly gave false testimony to the investigators that contradicted the actual evidence. Moreover, the two witnesses who saw Linda next to the van driver unequivocally stated that it was not Peter. They both personally knew this young man since they lived nearby, so they would have recognized him immediately. As a result, the police concluded that this young man simply wanted to draw attention to himself by confessing to a crime he did not commit. Perhaps the boy had certain mental problems, but he was definitely not involved in Linda's murder. After that, the investigators had no serious leads left. They continued the search for the van and its driver, combing the entire city. Even Linda's classmates joined the search, although the police were against it. The children rode bicycles through the streets, trying to find the same turquoise van. But it was all in vain. During the first month of the investigation, police interviewed 175 people, examined every inch of the girl's route from school to home, and appealed to the public for help. A few weeks later, they decided to publish an approximate portrait of the van driver, but this also yielded no results. Initially, the detectives did not want to do this, fearing that the criminal might flee the city. But with each passing day, they had to use more and more tools to solve this case. 2 months passed, and the police had a new lead. Another girl was assaulted in the same area. An unknown man dragged her into his van, took her to a deserted place, and then released her after the deed. The investigators immediately assumed that Linda's killer might be behind this crime. But here some discrepancies arose. The attacker was driving a white van, and the description of his appearance differed from that provided by witnesses in Linda's case. Soon the detectives managed to track down the suspect. He turned out to be a 32-year-old truck driver. His guilt was proven. But the witnesses stated that he looked nothing like the man Linda had been talking to. So the investigators concluded that this individual was not involved in her murder. Since then, no substantial leads have emerged in this case, although detectives continued to work on it in subsequent years. In 2001, 28 years after the murder, police sent samples of semen from Linda's body to the lab. Experts were able to extract the killer's DNA profile from them. But this man was not in the FBI database. This indicated that he had either not been held accountable for other criminal cases, or it happened before DNA samples began to be taken from criminals. A few years later, specialists tried to find his closest relatives in this database, but here too they failed. However, all these years, such things were practically impossible, as DNA analysis tools lagged far behind modern ones. A breakthrough in this field of forensics occurred around the mid-2010s. Now the police had new opportunities to search for suspects. Investigators in Linda's case also did not stand aside. In 2018, they turned to the private laboratory, Parabon. There, based on the DNA of Linda's killer, they created a portrait of this person. This innovative technology, known as DNA phenotyping, makes it possible to determine various features of a person's appearance, having only a sample of their DNA. Specialists created two portraits at once, demonstrating what the criminal might have looked like at the age of 20 and 60. Amazingly, these images were very similar to the descriptions of witnesses who saw the suspect in person 45 years ago. In such cases, the police usually publish the portraits in the media to attract public attention, hoping to reach those who might recognize this person. However, the investigators in Linda's case took an unprecedented step. In July 2018, exactly 45 years after the crime was committed, they published a series of messages on the social network Twitter on behalf of the victim herself. In a series of 6 to 8 tweets, the last day of Linda's life was described in detail. The detectives presented the information in such a way that it seemed as if the girl herself was telling the world about what happened to her on July 6, 1973. The narrative begins from the very morning. Linda shares the details of her school day. She recalls how she was offended by her mom for refusing to drive her, and how she had to walk home. All the facts used in these messages were carefully selected by investigators to create the most accurate and credible picture of that tragic day. The series of tweets ends with the sad statement that the killer is still at large, and it is at this point that the police, on Linda's behalf, published the portrait of the criminal. Now, after 45 years, I can speak again. And I have something very important that I want to share with you. There's a new lead in my case. A face reconstructed based on the DNA left by the killer. In 1973, such technologies did not yet exist, but now they are capable of changing everything. This creative approach instantly drew incredible attention to Linda's case from people all over the world. Police had previously shared information about unsolved crimes on social media, but a story told directly on behalf of the victim became something completely new and unprecedented. The suspect's portraits alone would have done little to help the investigation. They had a chance to play a decisive role only if someone recognized a familiar person in them and reported it to the police. So it was extremely important for investigators to draw as much attention to these images as possible. And they handled this task brilliantly. In total, the series of tweets was seen by over 7 million people. The police began to receive massive potential leads regarding the identity of the criminal, and detectives needed several months to thoroughly check each of them. Unfortunately, none of these tips led to a suitable suspect. However, the investigators were not going to give up, especially after Linda's case had attracted the interest of millions of people around the world. The detectives again turned to the Parabon laboratory, and this time asked them to try to find the killer's relatives using his DNA. Forensic scientists had already tried to do something similar in the early 2000s, but at that time the necessary tools and technologies simply did not exist. In the nearly 20 years that passed, the situation had changed significantly. Parabon experts had repeatedly managed to successfully identify people with family ties to the owner of a certain DNA sample. The information obtained as a result allowed investigators to directly reach the criminal. Work on the search for Linda's killer began in August 2018. It took specialists about 6 months to get the first results. Using private genealogical DNA databases, they were able to establish the identity of the killer's third cousin. For detectives, this meant that they had finally come close to solving the case. It remained only to thoroughly study this person's family tree and reach the main suspect. But the experts from Parabon did not stop there and continued to dig even deeper. And soon they were in for a completely unexpected discovery. In one of the private databases they found a DNA sample that completely matched the DNA of the killer himself. As it turned out, he had voluntarily uploaded his genetic profile to a database that allows one to find lost or distant relatives. It later became known that someone from his family had given him a special kit for genetic testing, necessary for entering the database. After 45 long years, the investigation finally had the killer's name, James Alan Neal. At the time of identification, he was 72 years old and lived in another state. In January 2019, detectives went after him. Before arresting the suspect, they needed to get a sample of his DNA for comparison, since the information from a private database would not have sufficient evidentiary power in court. On January 29, police set up surveillance on Neal's house, and also arranged with the garbage collection service to hand over everything the suspect threw out. Having received several items from which experts could extract his DNA, the detectives sent them to the lab, and they continued to monitor the man for the next 3 days. Unfortunately, the attempt to obtain a DNA sample from the suspect from these items was unsuccessful. Investigators urgently needed to come up with another way. And such an opportunity was not long in coming. They continued to follow Neal and noticed how he was sitting in his car in the parking lot and smoking. After he threw the cigarette butt on the asphalt and drove away, the police quickly picked up this potentially priceless piece of evidence. This time, the experts were lucky. They managed to isolate a DNA sample from the traces of saliva on the cigarette butt. And it perfectly matched the genetic profile of the killer left on Linda O'Keefe's body. This meant that James Neal was the very criminal they had been searching for nearly half a century. A few days later, the detectives held a press conference where they finally officially announced the arrest of the suspect. James Neal was born in 1946 in Chicago, and later his family moved to California. His parents often abused him, humiliated, beat, and even subjected him to sexual abuse. Because of this, the boy began to exhibit aggressive behavior from an early age. Already in his teens, he managed to commit a whole series of minor offenses, including illegal entry into other people's homes. After that, James dropped out of school and tried to get a job, but up to the age of 23, he could not stay long in any place. As it turned out, Neal had a very eventful criminal past. He was arrested more than 12 times for crimes of varying severity, from theft and car theft to armed robbery. At the same time, almost every time he managed to get off with a minimal punishment, after which he again took up the old. At the age of 25, James got married for the first time and settled with his wife in a suburb of Los Angeles. Their house was located about half an hour's drive from the area where Linda O'Keefe lived. 2 years after moving, Neal committed her murder. At that time, his wife was pregnant, and the man himself was on probation for less serious crimes committed in another state. After that, he came to the attention of the police several more times due to theft and forging bank checks, and also served a short term in prison for violating the terms of his probation. After being released, James managed to attract the attention of law enforcement 3 more times due to traffic violations. James Neal divorced his first wife, who bore him 2 daughters. For a while, he lived in different states, but eventually returned to California. In 1997, the man married a second time. His chosen one already had a child from a previous marriage, and soon the couple had a daughter together. After carefully studying the suspect's biography, the detectives made a shocking discovery. Neal could have been involved in dozens of cases of violence against children, but never bore responsibility for it. In 1995 and 2004, he kidnapped 2 girls, driving up to them in a car. The man took advantage of their helplessness, subjected them to violence, and then released them. In both cases, his guilt could not be proven, so the criminal escaped punishment. Subsequently, police suspected James of at least 5 similar incidents, when an unknown criminal in a car kidnapped young girls right off the street. In 2010, a girl with whom Neal attended the same church complained about him. She confessed that the 63-year-old man had been harassing her for several months. The victim told about a number of similar episodes, and the suspect even gave confessional testimony. But then something extremely strange and incomprehensible happened. This case was somehow hushed up, the victim withdrew her accusations, and Neal did not suffer any punishment. He returned to his usual life and for the next 9 years did not attract the attention of law enforcement, right up to the moment of his arrest for the murder of Linda O'Keefe. During interrogations, James denied his involvement in the crime and claimed that he had never kidnapped girls in a van. When shown a photograph of Linda, he stated that he was seeing her for the first time in his life. At the same time, the man noted that she somewhat resembled one of his daughters. However, since Neal's DNA was unequivocally found on the victim's body, the court would have found him guilty anyway. But the investigators still tried to gather as much evidence of his involvement as possible. They sought to find out if the suspect had a turquoise van, but could not find any confirmation of this fact. However, a logical explanation for this was soon found. It turned out that at the time of the murder, Neal was working in a residential complex and had access to a company van. During a search of the suspect's home, detectives found several hard drives with prohibited materials involving minors. Similar photos and videos were also found in the memory of his smartphone. Interesting information was also found on James' computer. It turned out that he was actively interested in the stories of criminals who committed violent crimes and were exposed thanks to DNA analysis. Apparently, the man was well aware that it was genetic expertise that could help the police link him to various crimes. Another stunning fact was revealed to investigators only after the suspect's arrest. When Neal was examined before being placed in a cell, a tattoo with the name Linda was noticed on his wrist. At first, the detectives assumed that in such a creepy way he immortalized the memory of his victim. But in reality, this turned out to be just a creepy coincidence. James got this tattoo long before committing the murder, which was documented. The trial in the case was supposed to begin in February 2020, a year after the suspect's arrest. However, due to the pandemic, it had to be postponed. Despite all the evidence, Neal continued to insist on his innocence. The investigators had no doubts that it was he who was Linda O'Keefe's killer. However, the case never came to trial. In May, James' health suddenly deteriorated and he was hospitalized. In 2 days spent in the hospital, the man died of lung cancer. Before his arrest, he did not even suspect his illness, and when the disease was finally diagnosed, it was too late to start treatment. Thus, after 47 years, a period was finally put in this high-profile case. The detectives who handled the investigation are still convinced that the number of Neal's victims may be much higher. They intend to continue digging from this angle in order to shed light on his other potential crimes. Unfortunately, Linda O'Keefe's parents passed away long before the police managed to identify and arrest their daughter's killer. For many years, the girl's mother blamed herself for what happened, because it was she who refused to pick Linda up from summer school that fatal day. The victim's sisters expressed sincere gratitude to the investigators who did not stop searching for the truth and finally managed to solve this confusing case. Their only regret was that their parents did not live to see this long-awaited day of justice. Please write your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. For those who are new here, subscribing is the best way to stay updated on future content. Also give a like please. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you for your support during this difficult time. Until next time, friends.